This video is to give you a little bit of feedback about the mock exam that you turned in on Monday. I'm going to give you some general comments and then also just talk about some misconceptions that I noticed and some things that I think might be helpful for you in other problems. So many of you are losing points because you're not including your context. You need to include context always. Don't write an answer that could be generic and could be put into place with a different situation. You want to include the context every single time. Also, you want to show your work. Even if the work seems simple to you, if there's two numbers that you're adding together, particularly like in a probability problem, you want to show what those two numbers are so that the reader can see where they came from. If you just magically get a number and it's not clear where they came from, you're going to lose points. So you have to show your work always. Also, when you're comparing, you want to actually compare. So you want to talk about both things. You want to say why the one thing is good and the other one is not. So specifically in this problem, you were talking about the sampling method and you were doing a cluster compared to a simple random sample. You need to talk about why the cluster was more practical than the simple random sample. Talk about both of those things. If you think you want to use normal CDF or table A, please just stop and ask yourself first, is this a normal distribution? And if it didn't tell you explicitly, then it is not, or unless you can see very clearly that it is normal. But in this particular problem, you were given a histogram that you just described and all of you said that it was skewed. And then you went on to use normal CDF. Please be very careful of that. Don't just apply normal distribution to things that are not normal. You also want to clearly define your parameters that you use in your hypotheses. Use the sentence stem from the question. Even if it is many, many words, write them all out because that's what you need to do to get full credit. I want to talk about the difference between a sample distribution and a sampling distribution. These two things have caused some confusion, I think, over the course of the whole school year, and I really want to try and clarify as best I can. A sample distribution is what's going on in this problem with the trees. They took a sample of 75 city blocks, those were the clusters, and they counted the number of dead trees, and they've created this distribution. This is the distribution for one sample that they took. It is skewed to the right. It is not normal. They asked you some questions about this sample distribution. If you were asked to interpret the sample standard deviation, which is what S is, it means that in this sample of 75 city blocks, typically the number of dead trees in each block varies by 2.88 from the mean of 2.36 dead trees. When you're interpreting standard deviation, use this word typically. You don't want to use the word average. Technically, to calculate it, you're actually not doing an average, you're dividing by n-1. So when you use the word average, it makes it sound, it's not technically correct. So a sampling distribution is if we took many, many, many samples of 75 clusters of trees. So we did this sample and we did it over and over and over. Think about that penny problem that we did where we took samples day after day after day until you were all really sick of doing it. We did many, very many of them. And when we did that, we then made a distribution of the means. That distribution of the means formed kind of a histogram and it has an approximately normal shape, even though the original distribution, the sample distribution, did not. And in fact, the population distribution does not necessarily have to be normal, but when you take many, many samples, those means, if you were able to take all of the possible samples, the distributions would be, that would be called the sampling distribution of the sample mean. So if you took all of the different means of each of those samples of 75 clusters of trees, that would form your sampling distribution. And this is the curve that we use when we're doing confidence intervals and p-values. This is the curve that you need to try and show is approximately normal, even though this one we know is clearly not. The sampling distribution will always be approximately normal if your sample size is large. And statisticians realize that if it's more than 30 or so, then that sampling distribution will always be approximately normal, regardless of what the shape was of the original sample distribution. If the sample size is small, like it's less than 30, then the original sample data needs to either be approximately normal, or at least it needs to not have any strong skew or outliers. So this one has a strong skew and some possible outliers. So if our sample size was less than 30 in this case, then we would not be able to show the normal condition would not be met, and the sampling distribution of sample means would not be an approximately normal distribution. I wanted to show you, this was not a question on here, but just comparing it to the standard deviation of the sample. The standard deviation, or most of the time you're actually going to be finding the standard error of a sampling distribution, means that typically the mean number of dead trees in each block varies by, you would take the sample standard deviation divided by the square root of 75, and it's going to differ from the true mean number of dead trees for all trees in the city. So for the standard deviation or the standard error of the sampling distribution, you're kind of comparing the actual true mean number of dead trees compared to what each of those means would be from each of the samples. So it's telling you basically how far away from the true mean each of your sample means is. All right, I hope that that helps to clarify the difference between those two things. So really think clearly when you're answering questions, are you talking about the actual sample distribution or the sampling distribution of sample means? Remember, you can also make a sampling distribution of sample proportions, and it works in kind of a similar way. The other thing I want to point out is the difference between sampling and experimental design. Many of you in this problem talked about this being a block design, and even though they were talking about city blocks, a block design is a specific statistical term that means something very specific. So you needed to talk about this one was in fact a cluster sample, and if you look at the differences between these different ways of either doing a sample or an experimental design. These are the 4 different ways we talked about doing an observational study or sampling, and these are the different ways we did an experiment. A simple random sample and a completely randomized design, those two are kind of equivalent, but one is for an observational study, one is for an experiment. A stratified random sample and a randomized block design are similar in that for both of them, you create groups that are homogeneous, that they're similar to one another. And then within them, for the stratified random sample, you select an SRS within each strata, and for the block design, you assign treatments within each of those blocks. The cluster sample is what was happening in this one. You create groups that are heterogeneous, where you have a variety of lots of different things. So you would expect in this one, each block, it's got a selection of different types of trees, and then you select a simple random sample of all of the possible clusters and sample all the members of those clusters. That is what was happening in this particular problem. A systematic random sample is if members are selected according to a random starting point and then a fixed periodic interval. So maybe you start at a random point and then you're going to take every 3rd person after that. And then just one other way that you can do an experimental design is the matched pairs design. And again, that's a special type of randomized block design where you do a block of size 2, and that's when you're going to have each pair randomly assigned both treatments. Remember, oftentimes the matched pairs is actually the same person being assigned 2 different treatments. If you're trying to match someone that's very similar, the person that's most similar to them would be themselves. So if you can do one person doing the same, having 2 different treatments assigned to them, that's the best type of matched pairs design. Hopefully this summary here will help you to kind of see, summarize the difference between the different types of observational studies and also the different types of experiments. All right, let me know if you have any other questions about that problem. Please look at the model solution and read the feedback that I gave you. Thanks.